Now, I will say, in regard to the anti-commandeering amendment, your position on whether or not it's a good idea really materially depends upon whether or not you think the Patient Protection and the Affordable Care Act is a good idea. I mean, and I'm not going to talk about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Everybody in this chamber, I suspect, has read literature on that and formed an opinion as to whether or not the Affordable Care Act is good or bad for the people of South Carolina and the people of the United States. If you think it's good public policy, if you think that the exchanges are working, if you think that it's actually increasing access to health care in a way that's sustainable, in a way that delivers quality health care, by all means you ought to oppose this anti-commandeering amendment, because it is clearly my purpose to deprive state assets from being utilized to hasten and speed up the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So if you think it's a good idea and if you think it's a good law, you would want that state spigot turned on. You would want state treasurer, state employees, state agencies helping to implement it. However, if by reading all the literature out there and after reading about how this act has been implemented by the current administration in Washington, D.C., with the various extensions and the carve-outs and the exemptions and quite frankly what I consider to be the shredding of the rule of law, if you think that the Affordable Care Act represents bad public policy, then you ought to stand foursquare for the proposition that not a single state taxpayer dollar ought to be used to hasten and speed the implementation of that Affordable Care Act. So that's the first thing the amendment does. The second thing it does is it says that we are not, as a matter of state policy, going to avail ourselves of the option under the Affordable Care Act to expand the Medicaid population to 138% of federal poverty. My understanding is that would take our Medicaid population from roughly 1.1 million, as it currently is, to about 1.7 million. And again, these are rough numbers. I may be off by tens of thousands, but that's a rough approximation of the kind of expansion that we would see in regard to the Medicaid pool if the Affordable Care Act authorization was exercised by the state. Now, on this side of the aisle, my friends raised the question, why would we not expand that Medicaid population? For the first 3 years, the federal government is going to pay for 100% of the cost of all those individuals that come on to the Medicaid rolls. It's not going to cost the state a penny. So why wouldn't you do it? And even after that, it's going to go to 90% as to that additional population by the federal government and 10% by the state. And after that, who knows? Well, it's the who knows that has me concerned, and let me tell you why. First of all, there is $17 trillion worth of debt and growing in Washington, D.C. I see absolutely no resolve on either the part of Republicans or Democrats in Washington, D.C. to do anything about curtailing that national debt at any time in the foreseeable future. Moreover, what I see are annual deficits that up until last year were approximately $1 trillion a year. Now, I think they've been whittled down now to about $700 or $600 million a year. But it's indisputable that that debt is growing very quickly. But what really concerns me about that debt and what really makes me look at this Medicaid expansion with a very, very suspicious eye is the way the federal government is going about keeping its doors open. I mean, none of us could end up spending more than we take in for very long without there being foreclosures or evictions or your family starving. So you have to ask yourself, how is it that Washington, D.C. is able to do it? Well, I guess one answer to the question is they borrow the money, and that's true. The United States Treasury on a weekly basis goes out and sells Treasury securities. Primary dealers, foreign governments, other entities buy these Treasury securities, which is essentially a loan to the federal government. And those dollars are then used to prop up that deficit and allow the federal government to keep the doors open. Okay, so we're borrowing our way. We're digging a deeper and deeper hole. But the concern and the worry is actually far greater than that, because what happens in regard to about 75 to 80% of those T security purchases on that weekly basis are by so-called primary dealers like J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs. And what they do is they go out and they buy those Treasury securities knowing that they can turn around very shortly and sell it at a profit to the Federal Reserve that will create more money to buy those securities and expand its balance sheet. We've seen the Federal Reserve's balance sheet quadruple in the last 5 years. We've seen the monetary base in this country quadruple in the last 5 years. The inventory of assets that they have on their balance sheet are basically T-notes or securities that have almost zero interest. What's going to happen when interest rates rise? as it's already predicted they're going to be. They're not going to be able to unload those. No one's going to buy those unless they steeply discount. And then we're really in a hurry. Then we're really in a difficulty, because all of a sudden things start to snowball and the financial predicament becomes more and more dire. And at some point in time, even the United States Congress isn't going to be able to simply paper over this by raising the debt ceiling and have to take some action. And I submit to you the very first thing they will do, aside from raising taxes, they'll try to do that first. But the second thing they'll do is they're going to stop the amount of money, the transfer payments that go from Washington, D.C. back down to the states for roads and health care and Title I education and other federal programs. We'll still send money up there as taxpayers for Washington, D.C., but less and less are there going to be transfer payments coming back down to the states to cover those programs to the extent we have in the past. So that's why I have a very substantial concern in regard to expanding our Medicaid population from 1.1 million to 1.7 million, because I fear, and I think reasonably so, that in a few years' time, that federal spigot's going to turn off or at least slow down. And Senator from Finance, you're going to have to go ahead and with loaves and fishes, figure out how you're going to cover Medicaid expenses at that point in time, because there's not going to be the same amount of money coming down from the Washington, D.C. You'll have more people in Medicaid. You'll have 1.7 million people in there, but you won't have nearly the amount of money from Washington, D.C. coming down to provide health care services or insurance. So that's why HHS Director Tony Keck thinks it's a bad idea to avail ourselves of the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. That's why the governor thinks it's a bad idea. That's why this body last year, both the House and the Senate, decided it was a bad idea to expand Medicaid. And I would submit to you that our financial predicament up in Washington, D.C. hasn't improved since last year. In fact, it's gotten worse. And so there's even more reason to not accept that expansion. So the second part of this amendment states that we will not avail ourselves as a matter of state policy to expanding that Medicaid population as authorized by the Affordable Care Act. The third thing the amendment does is it says, as was decided last year by the governor and this body, that we're not going to create a state-run health care exchange under the Affordable Care Act. Now, you still have a federally run health care exchange that will continue to operate, and individuals will continue to enroll in that federally created exchange, and people will continue to buy policies from that federally created exchange, and that won't be affected at all by this amendment. But it does say that the state is not going to set up that exchange. And here's why that's important, Senator from Greenville, and I touched on this a little bit yesterday. The way the Affordable Care Act is worded is it says that the IRS can levy the tax or the penalty or whatever you want to call it to individuals and employers who don't comply with the mandate. They can only levy that tax or fee and take that money from citizens and businesses and put it into an exchange and use that as a subsidy if the vehicle is a state-created exchange. It's very, very clear, okay? And it's not just a Scrivener's error. It doesn't appear one time. It appears throughout the Affordable Care Act. And if you look at the legislative history of the Affordable Care Act, it's very clear that the drafters of that particular legislation wanted that particular process of levy and subsidy to only take place through state-created exchanges. And so it's critically important that we adopt as the policy of this state that we're not going to create a state exchange. Now, right now we have a governor and Governor Haley that has said that she is not going to do it. She's not going to take steps in that regard. But I think it's so critically important because of the way that Affordable Care Act is drafted and because I want to protect our citizens from fines and penalties and taxes being levied against them for not complying with a mandate. And of course, that assumes at some point in time the president will stop continuing when the deadline for those mandates are. I'm assuming that's going to be the case. But it's critically important that we adopt the amendment to go ahead and say we're not going to create a state exchange in South Carolina for that particular reason. The fourth thing this amendment does is it acknowledges that the Affordable Care Act, in addition to setting up the health care exchanges, and in addition to creating the employer mandate and creating the individual mandate and doing various other things, it also establishes grants, monies that state agencies can apply for, draw down, and then spend in furtherance of the objectives of the Affordable Care Act. That goes on a routine basis right now. We have state agencies pulling down grants right now. We have no idea whatsoever as a legislative body what strings are attached to that, what obligations our state agencies are assuming by virtue of applying for those dollars, taking those dollars, and spending it. And the best example I can think of is back when the stimulus bill was passed, there was a chunk of money, Senator from Pickens, if you'll remember, to supplement the unemployment fund that we were going to pay benefits from. And one of the objections that we raised to taking that stimulus money was that if you accepted that money, you had to make unemployment insurance benefits available to part-time employees, because that was a string that was attached to it. And the argument that the then governor made, Governor Sanford, is that having to change state law to make unemployment benefits available to part-time workers outpace over time the amount of money that was being drawn down in the stimulus. Now, I point that out as an example to a string that was attached to a so-called gift of money from the federal government. So the fourth thing that my amendment does is says that if any state agency wants to apply for an ACA grant, for an Affordable Care Act grant, not any other grant, but an Affordable Care Act grant, that there's going to be a public hearing, there's going to be an explanation if there's any strings, and there's going to be a vote of this body that can be authorized. And I think that's appropriate because more and more federal policy is implemented through strings that are attached to grants that are applied for by state agencies and then spent. And I think it's a dereliction of our responsibility not to have a process in place to look at those grants and to figure out what we're getting ourselves into by accepting them. That's the fourth part of my amendment. The fifth part relates to navigators, the individuals that are being paid money by the federal government to go out there and round up people and to reach out to people and give people information and hustle them into the exchanges as quick as they can. And we all read about that. We talk about the race. There's a race against time. They're trying to sign up more and more younger people. They got to sign up more younger people, too many old people. And so they're directing their attention to the young people. And the navigators, shift over there and come up with hip new ads that are going to appeal to individuals from 18 to 30. These navigators are, in essence, doing what insurance agents and insurance brokers and other purveyors of those products are doing. The Affordable Care Act itself recognizes the authority on the part of the states to regulate the activities of the navigators. It is recognized that we have that authority. So I sat down with Ray Farmer, the Department of Insurance Commissioner, and I said, I would like you to establish some baseline, very baseline and basic provisions in regard to navigators so the people of South Carolina are protected against falsehoods or misstatements or deceptive practices. And he drafted that and helped me with it, and that's what's in this amendment. We've kept a careful eye on what other states have tried to do with the regulation of their navigators, because it's possible, Senator from Newberry, to go overboard. It's possible to do too much and to go ahead and restrict their First Amendment rights, and we don't want to do that. So we carefully crafted this language to where the interests of South Carolinians would be protected, but at the same time was not so draconian as to interfere with the First Amendment rights of those navigators. That's the fifth part of the bill. The sixth part of the bill says that nothing in this amendment, should we pass it, in any way affects the deference that Congress has historically shown toward insurance commissioners regarding the regulation of insurance products within the state boundaries. We like that. We want to continue that. I want Ray Farmer to continue to have the authority to protect South Carolinians against unscrupulous practices and to regulate insurance. And so we have a safe harbor there to say that nothing in this amendment is meant to diminish or in any way alter what Congress has historically recognized as being a state province of regulation of the insurance industry. And then lastly, the seventh thing is that if and when we pass this amendment, that we ask the governor to please share it with her fellow governors so that this can be replicated in other parts of the country. And I think that's extraordinarily important because, again, as I touched on yesterday, the federal government a lot of times passes laws knowing full well it does not have the bureaucracy or the human infrastructure to implement those laws, and it depends on the complicity of the states. It depends on the states cooperating with them, sharing the expense, using their employees, using their agencies. If 50 states finally recognize and raise up and say we're not merely political subdivisions of the federal government, that we're not simply there for the convenience of implementing what Washington passes, we can finally start to do something about what I think has happened since the New Deal, which has been a steady erosion of state power and more power being concentrated in Washington, D.C. It need not be that way. As I told the senator from Charleston yesterday, the United States Supreme Court in the Prince decision showed us a way to not be complicit in that power grab, to stand up and say, we're not going to spend our state tax dollars to help you implement your law.